Welcome to Inspire Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter Swoboda, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change. I hope you enjoyed the last episode, our 100th podcast, which I had a very special guest with me, my wife Lauren, and we talked about the skills and attitudes and values to have to create a long-term relationship, partnership, marriage, whatever you want to call it, but for the long haul. And I hope that it gave everybody some food for thought, some reflection, maybe even create some turning points in that context. It's never, ever too late to change. I don't care whether you're 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, there's always that space where we can make a difference, either for ourselves, in a relationship, or sometimes in the world. So I want to stick with that theme about relationships because, as some of you are probably aware, I do a lot of work with teenage boys, as well as doing quite a bit of work with parents trying to deal with teenage boys. And one of the things that concerns me is that there seems to have been this emergence of really significant issues in that space. So over the next little while, in the next few podcasts, I'm going to address this to both fathers and mothers, but I want dads to take particular notice of this. And some of it is a little bit different at the moment because of COVID and the lockdown, especially in Australia, but I think this is a message for the ages. So to start off with, I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of aligning fathers and sons. We often have a challenge differentiating between being a dad and being a friend. Now, I've found this really nice little quote by Jim Valvano, and he said, "My father gave me the greatest gift anyone can give another person. He believed in me." And I like it because I think it's a really good foundation to kick off with. And so for this podcast, I want to tell you a little bit of a story that came out of personal experience. We're holidays. And on that holiday, in a very sort of exclusive sort of holiday town, my wife and I went shopping. And whilst she was in the shop, it was a fairly small shop, so I thought I'd sit it out and wait on the sort of walkway. I defaulted to a popular pastime of mine, and that's people watching. So it comes with a territory for me. As a psychologist, most of my waking hours are spent thinking, reflecting, and theorising about the human condition. You know, why is it that we do the things that we do, and why are we the way that we are? Suddenly my attention was directed towards an ear-shattering noise of a preschooler who was making his dad's life simply miserable. Apparently, a dad in some sort of blissful, ignorant state had broken this kid's unspoken rule that he was not allowed to sit down in his son's presence. The kid, probably about 4 or 5, now was giving full vent to his displeasure by vocally and physically hassling Dad. Dad, in his toolbox, pulled out the one strategy that probably wasn't going to work ever. But he tried to ignore the kid. And as predicted, this did nothing other than escalate the kid into further tantrum. And the kid retaliated with a very well-placed right hook. But even that didn't sort of elicit any change in Dad's strategy. Now, at this point, you can imagine, I'm sort of hooked. I'm watching Dad's stoicism, you know, and in a way you can sort of get it. What do? I'm in public, my kid's throwing a tantrum, it's embarrassing. I'm really not sure what to do with him. I'd really like to smack him, but that's not going to happen. And he's starting to throw desperate glances around. He was obviously looking for his wife in this context. And the message was really, really clear. He was looking to be rescued because I'm not sure what I'm doing here. But unfortunately for him, there was absolutely no intervention. Even the gods weren't coming down to rescue him. And so Dad, abandoned to his own devices, grappled. The conflict in his face was really, really evident. So Dad resorts to another tool in his kit, right? So his final weapon in this little conflict, that, from the kid's perspective, was going quite well, was to reason with the boy. But this had absolutely no impact at all. If anything, it seemed to add fuel to the fire. The kid was completely immune to any form of logic or rational argument. And again, Dad desperately looked around, and suddenly there was a change in his manner. A sense of relief flickered across his face. And I sort of tracked his gaze, curious as to what that shift was about. And there was a woman looking obviously harassed by her son's unruly behaviour, and she rapidly approached the two who were stuck in this conflict. Now, what emerged was really interesting because from her perspective, there was no look of understanding or compassion for our, unsuspecting paternal would-be hero. On the contrary, I was trying to figure out who she was more cross with, her son or her husband. However, the truly telling thing was that Dad, who could have made a much more heroic stand in many respects, now withdrew completely. He didn't get up and walk away, but he withdrew emotionally. And so there was Mum left to placate the boy, who no doubt, in my view, will strike again. And as he gets older, I'm pretty sure he's going to keep escalating this. So you got to keep in mind that in this little scenario, in this scene, it's almost like, a screenplay. There's tons of messages and lessons. But I want to start at a point where I'm going to go, okay, dads, if we're going to keep withdrawing, we are going to be in serious trouble. Now, what was evident was that in that particular scenario, Dad appeared to have absolutely no authority, and he didn't exhibit any sort of personal power. And I think that's a really important aspect. We tend not to talk about that in parenting a lot. Now, I differentiate between power, that is about dominating and controlling, and personal power, which comes from a place of empowerment, where I'm solidly attached to myself, and it gives me a greater sense of awareness and a greater level of flexibility, so I can deal with different situations much better. So I spend quite a bit of time with dads looking at how I can help them to do that, because one of the interesting aspects is that quite often I have to deal with two parents who are at odds in terms of their parenting. And this isn't just with older kids, like teenagers, although then it becomes particularly magnified. But it's often the case right from the word get-go. And one of the problems that I see in that context is that from a very early time in the parents' life as parents, dealing with their child or children, a lot of mums will basically sideline dad because he's not doing it right, or he's at least not doing it to her satisfaction. And in parenting, that I see as a serious problem. You know, a lot of dads talk to me about the fact, you know, they withdraw, they don't engage because no matter what they do, they feel like they're always going to get it wrong. And so one of the principles is that we need to appreciate in each other the fact that we're going to do things differently, but generally if we come from a values base that's aligned, we can't sort of necessarily go too far wrong. So, you know, the solution in this situation is what, you might ask? Well, part of it is that mum and dad need to begin to work together. So in Making Good Men Great, one of the core values is cooperation, and that's not just, you know, the society at large. That's in every possible way, is that, you know, as a couple, as parents, we need to have an open dialogue. We need to be transparent. We need to agree on how we're going to move forward. Right? Really, really important stuff. And so this particular podcast, I want to encourage dads to look at their level of engagement and contact and attachment. Now, this is particularly important in young children. We don't leave mums to do all the contact work, all the attachment work. You know, a lot of people talk to me about, the maternal instinct. There is no such thing as a maternal instinct. Both men and women can be primary caregivers in a child's life. And that child will attach to that adult caregiver as if it was a biological mother. Now, ideally, you know, we have the situation of a biological parent and the biological father who are working together. But ultimately, it's that creating an attachment environment where the child feels safe and secure. And when I feel safe and secure in myself, I'm going to start to begin to be a really good role model. And remember, you know, in the podcast where I talked about, you know, mindful listening and mindful speaking, self-awareness is really, really important. It's important for me to regulate my emotions. Because as much as the child hears what I say, it's much, much more tuned into how I'm saying it. The non-verbal communication is critical, especially in infants. Eye contact, facial expressions, and they need to be authentic. There's some really interesting research that was done that showed that infants can differentiate between an authentic and an inauthentic smile. Fascinating stuff. And so for lots of neurological reasons, that's particularly important into helping those aspects of the brain to develop that helps that child to begin to relate to itself and the world in a healthy way. So the whole point here, the first thing that we need to do is we need to think very clearly about what is it that I'm modelling and how am I connecting with my child. And this goes on throughout their developmental years and sometimes into their adulthood. Now, if we've got that really good foundation, then we've got it made in many respects. We're going to have children who will cooperate. They're not going to be perfect, but they're going to be a lot easier to manage. And we're certainly not going to have the sort of temper tantrums that our little 4 or 5-year-old decided to apply in public. Now, that's not to say kids don't chuck temper tantrums. They will, but the question is, how do I, as an adult, deal with that child in that particular process? And I'm going to talk about some of that stuff as we go along. So one of the other issues before we finish today that I want to talk about is the issue of, as a parent, being afraid. If I'm afraid of my child, and, this is not just as a teenager, but it's also when they're little, I remember seeing someone in a hospital when my wife had our first child, and this guy looked petrified picking the baby up. He was particularly reluctant initially and needed a lot of encouragement to pick the child up. And, I couldn't help but wonder what had happened to him personally, but also what it was that made him fear picking the child up. And I think that that's really, sad in many respects. I was very lucky. I was very much a hands-on dad. And perhaps it wasn't luck, but, perhaps it was because I've got a generally fairly pushy sort of personality and I wasn't going to be left out. But my partner, my wife, wanted me to be completely involved. And there was never any question about that. So we worked out very early on getting into a rhythm in our parenting and understanding what the values were and how we wanted to raise our children. We would have discussions about it. And when the going was tough, we'd have more discussions about it. But the big issue is this capacity to begin to align with our children. And so for fathers, that alignment with boys is particularly important. Ultimately, until they're about 12, we tend to be heroic in their eyes. We are the person that they look up to. So we really need to ask ourselves, what is it that we're showing them? What are they learning from us? How do they perceive my interaction with their mother? Because that's going to have an influence. So there's lots of stuff in that. So over the next couple of podcasts, I'm going to go into a number of topics. One of which is communication between fathers and sons, but also understanding what the tasks are in parenting and in the father-son relationship. And one of the things that's really, really important is that as a dad, I need to have meaningful conversations with my son. And it's not just about getting a checklist about what they have and haven't done. So, one of the things that I often say is that being a man is about who you are as a human being. It's not based necessarily just on your sex and the gender that you have. Being a father is about a role you've taken on and a role that is importantly aligned with who you are. And in that context, we need to look at 3 elements. We need to look at our awareness. We need to look at how we align and how we create attunement between myself and my child. It also means that I need to be attuned to myself. So, in a sense, being match fit. So, drinking a lot or taking drugs and all that sort of stuff isn't going to help me become a better parent. There are many times when I've worked with fathers who, especially on the weekend, suffer hangovers most of the time. Now, I dare anybody to be cool, calm and collected when they've got a hangover trying to deal with a kid. It's not going to happen. And so that's not appropriate. All right, I hope that's given you a bit of a sort of feel for where we're going to be going in the next few podcasts, and I hope you're going to join me. talk a lot more about this in my book, Making Good Men Great, Surfing a New Masculinity. Because the other thing that we need to figure out is, what is it I want my son to grow into? Unfortunately, there are still a lot of boys who manage to pick up very misogynistic messages, both sometimes from their dads, but also from their peer group, and especially in schools, despite the school's almost monumental efforts to squash that sort of behaviour. It's still there. So in the next podcast, one of the things that I might be looking at, probably will, is what it means to live in alignment, firstly individually, but then also in relationships. And after that, I want to talk a little bit about sort of some of the micro skills that are useful to pick up on and how to put those into practice. Stuff like, what is masculinity about as a father, and what do I expect to see in my son? And part of that, as I always say, is that as men, we need to rethink masculinity because the patriarchal stuff ain't working. And it's one of the reasons why we have lots of psychological distress and disturbance in our boys and young men and older men. Okay, until next time, I hope you found this interesting, and I'm looking forward you tuning in to me for the next podcast. Until then, take care.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change with Gunter. Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com to get into contact. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email producers at miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda, Miranda, at noirtainment, noirtainment.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.